Alright, hello class and welcome back. This is my background video to the conflict that is going on, the civil war in Syria. Alright, to start, let's do some geography. This country here, you can see on this video, this is Syria. Syria is small, it is poor, and it's a crowded country. It's about the same size as Washington State, or about the same size as Spain. But don't let the size confuse you. Only a small section, about a quarter of this country, is arable land. You can see here the Syrian desert. And so the area that is arable would be this area that's in green. So the economic Syria is about as large as a combination of Maryland and Connecticut, or about the same size as Switzerland. Most of the country is desert, and some of that area is suitable for grazing, but less than 10% of the surface is permanent cropland. Except for a narrow belt along the Mediterranean, so this area here, the whole country is subject to extreme temperatures that can cause frequent dust storms and drought. And so the years between 2006 and 2011 was one of the most devastating droughts, very similar to what the United States experienced during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. From about 2001 to 2010, it's estimated that Syria had over 60 significant dust storms. And while in addition to creating these huge clouds, the most important part of the dust storm is that it removes the top layer of topsoil, right? And so this area, struck by drought, became rife for civil war. And in addition to the drought, the high temperature that this area received between 2006 and 2010 also resulted in an impact on the temperatures. So there were higher extremes. So hot areas were much warmer than normal, and the amount of rainfall was significantly less than than it normally is. According to an article in The Atlantic, it says, quote, "Even the relatively favored areas had rainfalls of just 20 to 40 centimeters, about 8 to 15 inches, where 20 centimeters is regarded as the absolute minimum to sustain agriculture. And the national average was less than 10 centimeters, or about 4 inches of rain. Worse, rainfalls in Syria, mainly in the winter months when it is less beneficial for crops. Thus, areas with less than 40 centimeters are heavily dependent upon irrigation. But groundwater has been so heavily tapped in recent years that the water table in many areas has fallen below what a farmer can access." And then so what you're seeing is that in this time right before the start of the Syrian civil war, only about 13,000 square kilometers could be irrigated, which means that this area was in the midst of this, not just a huge drought, but an economic recession caused by this drought. Today, this nation of about 2.5 million people, its number one source of income is agriculture, which is about 20% of the GDP, and agriculture employed about 17% of that population. But because of the rise in fighting, Syria has had to look for other ways of making profit, of making income. Before the fighting, oil fields produced about 300,000 barrels of oil per day. But Syrians, the people themselves, consumed the majority of that. Only about 70,000 barrels of oil a day were exported. And this oil supplied about 20% of the GDP. But because of the war, production has dropped, and today those numbers are far lower. So the bottom line is that this country here, nestled on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by Turkey on its north, Iraq on this border, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, and close neighbors to Saudi Arabia, because of the drought of 2006 to 2010, right, the population of Syria and its resource ratio was out of balance. Right? There was not enough food, there's not enough water, there's far too many people. And in addition, when you have conflict on either side, with Iraq going through its own civil wars in the first half of the 2003, 2008, to the north, more recently, where we've had Turkey, and to the south, surrounded by Israel. Right, this area has seen an influx in the number of refugees, making this area even more prone to be out of resource, out of balance. Now, if we take a moment and we look back at some of the history of Syria, what predates this modern civil war, what we'll find is that this area, Syria, this land, before it was given these boundaries, this area has long been fought over by foreign empires. And so these empires include the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Macedonian Greeks, the Romans, the Mongols even made their way into Syria. We had the Turks, and more recently the British and the French. There's only been one period in Syrian history when the local people had control of their own empire, and that was a relatively short period in the 7th and 8th centuries AD. But this area has predominantly been overwhelmingly Muslim. Also of interest is that this area is composed of a variety of smaller communities. As I've mentioned, because this has been this area has been overtaken by so many foreign empires, these empires will send their people, their armies, into Syria to help control and maintain that area. But then as war continued to rise, as new empires overthrew old empires, many groups of people were just left behind, got married, had families, became integrated into this community. And so while historically this area has been predominantly Muslim, there are small leftover communities of a variety of different groups. And so today, as we look at it, we can see that there are groups left over from the Ottoman Empire, including Orthodox. We have Catholic groups and other Christian groups. We have the Alawis. We have Ismailis. And we have other sorts of Shia Muslims. We have the Yazidis, Kurds. There's communities of Jews and communities of Druze living here, scattered throughout Syria. When we look at the borders of Syria, these borders haven't always existed in the way that they do. And in reality, if you look at it, these areas are a variety of smaller communities which can be easily lumped together, where the Jews are located in one corner of the country, and the Druze are in another, and the Kurds in another. Because of the modernization of Syria, we've seen that a political boundary has been placed on top of it. But really what we're looking at is a variety of smaller communities that formed of different religious groups forced to live side by side. Also interesting to note is that given the number of empires that have ruled the area which is today known as Syria, it is hard to interject a foreign power's culture and religion onto local people. Right? They have their own customs, their own codes of behaviors, and if you seek to force these groups to live by yours, you'll have unhappy people. And so really what we see among Syrians is that these groups, these small enclaves of different communities of different religious groups, have largely been allowed to operate and have control over themselves. They've been given a lot of autonomy in terms of local laws and customs. Now, in terms of specifically where these groups, these different enclaves are located, most of Syria is composed of Sunni Muslims. And so think about most of this area of Syria as being home to Sunni Muslims. Here in the areas that border the Mediterranean Sea, this fertile area, this area is controlled by the Alawites. And here in these smaller cities like Homs and Hama and Aleppo, these areas have long been home to other Shiite groups, so another group of Muslims. In between the cities of Aleppo, Idlib, Hama, and Homs, and in between the area controlled by the Alawites is a small section which has been overlapped primarily by Christian groups. In addition, there are some areas here in Deir az-Zawar and al-Hazaka, which are also controlled primarily by Christians. Further in the south, in the areas that border Jordan and this area that borders Lebanon, you will see that this area is primarily controlled by the Druze people. Okay, so let me just change course for a second, and let's ask this question. How did Syria become Syria? Given that so many different groups had their hands in Syria, how did Syria, the country that we know it to be today, how was it formed? Well, Syria, as we know it was formed today, comes about in the aftermath of World War I. And during World War I, Great Britain and France were at war with the Ottoman Empire, which had sided with Germany and Austria. Before the war was over, Great Britain and France had decided that they would, in what became known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that they would divide the area of the Middle East between France and Great Britain. And so France would get the area, which is today this area north of Syria, and England, or Great Britain, would get the area south of it. And so in the aftermath of the war, the French decided that instead of establishing a single state, that they would create multiple states, one state for all the different communities, the different groups. And so in about 1924, Syria was divided into a lot of smaller states. So this area here in the south part bordering Jordan was known as the Jabal Druze. This area became Damascus, right? The area here from Damascus upward, and then down and taking the rest of the Syrian desert. The area to the east, including Aleppo, would be known as Aleppo. So this area here. This area up here, which is now part of Turkey, would be known as Alexandrette. This area here, which is controlled primarily by the Alawites, would be known as the Alawite state, and then this would be Lebanon, which it is Lebanon today. Now, this was the original plan, but these divisions didn't work. And so, shortly after establishing these smaller states, the French reversed course and instead united the country, and they attempted to change its social and cultural orientation. So instead of Arabic, the French tried to create a common language, French. They tried to force these Arabs to practice French customs and practice French law. The French promoted Catholicism as a way to undercut Islam and as also a way to favor the minorities who they were trying to give control of this to instead of to the Muslim majority. And so in the 1920s and the 1930s, we see this more or less imperialistic French colony that Syrians spoke French and were in many ways was an offshoot of European France. And thus it continued throughout much of the 1930s with very little sense of a very specific idea of Assyrian statehood or nationhood. But these things would give rise shortly thereafter. During this period that France was in control of Syria, the French were very heavy-handed with enforcing their French culture. And so in a variety of years, in 1920, in 1925, in 1926, and in 1945, the French bombarded Damascus and as a way of forcing these Syrians to embrace French rule. Ultimately, the British would see to the liberation of the Syrian people. And in 1941, the British invaded and were successful in kicking out the last of the French. The last soldier did not leave Syria until April 17th, 1946, which then became Syria's National Day, or their Day of Independence. After independence came, after the French left, Syria tried many ways or many times to establish their own country. But nothing stuck. There were repeated coups and military dictatorships that would ultimately fail. And so this country, which had been under the control of foreign invaders for hundreds of years, finally given independence, are fighting amongst themselves on who should be in control and what faction, what party should be in control. At one point, in 1958, the Syrian army actually gave control of the entire country to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, Nasser, the president of Egypt, was reluctant to accept, but ultimately accepted control of Syria. Right? The Syrians, unable to control themselves, asked a foreign country to govern it on its behalf. And so the Egyptians would do so for about 3 years. Now, another thing that would define Syria for the next 30 years, once it was given its independence, were frequent border skirmishes with neighboring Israel. There were wars between Syria and Israel in 1948, in 1967, and in 1973. And in fact, Israel, after one of these skirmishes, claimed the Golan Heights in 1963. Sorry, that's not 1963. 1967, Israel occupied about 1,200 square kilometers of Syrian territory, which is known as the Golan Heights. So, in 1970, after years, even a full generation of attempts to gain some type of political clout and establish a government, in 1970, Hafez al-Assad, the leader of the current the father of the current president of Syria, would establish himself as the Syrian president. Assad, his family came from the Alawi minority of Syria, which today only comprises about 1 in 8 Syrians. The Alawis, much like Jews, consider themselves to be God's chosen people, but Orthodox Muslims consider them to be heretics. But under Ottoman pluralism, it really didn't matter one's religious background. And so it didn't really matter whether he was Muslim or Christian, Alawi, or a Jew. And so in 1970, al-Assad becomes president, and he represents what is known as the Ba'ath Party, B-A-A-T-H. The Ba'ath Party literally means the Resurrection Party. The goal of the Ba'ath Party, this idea of resurrection, was strange. Like, in addition to wanting to kick the French and French culture out of their country, they also really wanted to become just like France. They believed that their future lay in unity and in socialism. And so what al-Assad will try to do, he will try to bridge the gap between the rich and the poor through a modified version of socialism. They believe that they would have to modify Islam because they didn't consider Islam to be politically powerful enough or specific enough to create a good society. In 1973, al-Assad will implement a new constitution, and in this new constitution, he removes the requirement that the president of Syria has to be a Muslim, which, of course, as you would imagine from the Muslim majority, will lead to immediate protests. The Muslim Brotherhood will call Assad the enemy of Allah, and they called for jihad, or holy war, to be waged against him. And so between 1976 and 1982, there were a series of revolts and attacks against al-Assad and his government. But nonetheless, the government was able to survive intact, which perhaps a modern miracle, given their inability to remain intact in previous years. Assad will continue to reign through the 1990s. In 1994, knowing that he wouldn't be able to govern forever, President Assad began grooming his eldest son, who's named Bashar al-Assad, to take over for him as president. Bashar, the oldest son, was called the Golden Knight. He was an award-winning horseman. He was a colonel in the Republican Guard. He was a civil engineer by trade and held a PhD in military sciences, hence the name the Golden Knight. He was described by the American CIA director at that time, or the American CIA director Michael Hayden, to be similar to Sonny from the Godfather series. However, in 1994, Bashar al-Assad would die in a tragic car accident. And so, President al-Assad will turn his attention to his lesser-known younger son, Bashar al-Assad, who at this time was completing a postgraduate training in ophthalmology in London. So at the time of his brother's death, Bashar al-Assad was studying to become an eye doctor. And with his brother's death, suddenly the spotlight was shown onto Bashar al-Assad. He was rushed home, where he began to be groomed for the presidency. In 2000, Hafez al-Assad, president, would die, and Bashar took over for him as the first president. His first order was to amend the Constitution of Syria, just like his father had before him, and he lowered the minimum age requirement for a president from the age 40, as the Constitution had stated, to the age of 34, which, no surprise, was al-Assad's age. Even though he took over for his father, there was a democratic vote, and al-Assad won with 99.7% of the vote. So I'm not sure if we can call that a democratic vote or not. He won with almost every vote. During the 2000s, new president Bashar al-Assad established an allegiance with Hezbollah and with Iran. He became increasingly critical of the United States, of Israel, of Saudi Arabia, and of neighboring Turkey, which had become an ally of the United States, and it allowed the United States to place military bases within its country. In 2002, George Bush labeled Syria as one of the axis of evils, which also included North Korea and Iraq. And so that is the background. That is the background of Syria, and that is how Bashar al-Assad would become president. In the mid-2000s, a series of political revolutions will take place across the Arab states, known as the the Arab Spring, in which young people, influenced by technology and by popular culture, and with a desire to see things change in their country, began to oppose dictators across the area. And so we see successful uprisings taking place in in Egypt and in other areas. And those would continue into Syria, where young people would take to the streets in protest of Bashar al-Assad and ask for a true democracy. And it was shortly thereafter that Bashar al-Assad, seeing that his power, his grasp over control of his country was fading, leashed out against his people and began waging a war against these rebels. All right, this ends my overview of the Syrian conflict, or at least the background of the Syrian conflict. In the readings for this week, you will also see more about the grounds on. How did the war really begin? Who was involved? And how has this war evolved over time? All right, I look forward to seeing your comments. I hope you enjoyed this overview.